Hi everyone, I'm David Fisher, and this is Presidential Chronicles, the series of books and videos on American history as seen through the lives of the presidents of the United States. This episode is from the life of James Garfield, and the focus is General Officer. The year is 1862, and Garfield and his men were coming off their big victory at Middle Creek. They had kicked the Confederates out of Kentucky. He had been promoted to Brigadier General, and now in a new assignment. He had about 4,000 men under his command. For his brigade, he had regiments coming from Ohio and Michigan and Indiana. But they had no rest, no time to sort of organize and get ready. They were immediately called into the fight. General Ulysses Grant had been surprised April 6, 1862 by the Confederates who came out from behind their works in Corinth, Mississippi, crossed over into Tennessee in the southern part of the state and surprised and attacked the Union forces who were there in a place called Pittsburgh Landing right off the Tennessee River. Well, there was brutal fighting that day, hand-to-hand combat, back and forth all day long. Thousands lay dead on the field of battle, and the battle was called Shiloh because Shiloh Church right in the middle of this battlefield. And Grant found his men pushed all the way back to Pittsburgh Landing by the time night began to fall. Well, word had gone out, reinforcements to come from any and all directions, and that caught General James Garfield and his men to double quick as fast as they could to get to this field of battle. They shed their baggage and they kept going that afternoon, that evening, that night, to the following morning with very little rest. They finally arrived on the morning of April the 7th when Grant had decided to counterattack. And that counterattack was underway when they arrived on the field of battle. And in fact, by the time Garfield's men finally got to the front, the battle was essentially over. It was a victory in the end, but a horrific fight with thousands that lay dead. Garfield commented that I marched my men to the front just in time to see the close of the greatest battle ever fought on this continent. The battlefield is 6 miles long, 6 miles wide, and I can never begin to describe the horrors I have witnessed. Hundreds and even thousands of dead were lying around, and a great many thousands more were wounded. The cannonballs fell thick around me, but I was mercifully spared. Garfield and his men, despite all that effort to get there on time, had missed out on the fight, but they were still considered fresh troops, so they were going to be put right on duty again to guard the territory that they were now defending. And in fact, the next day they had duty, horrific duty, mortuary duty, where they buried thousands of their comrades. The immediate assignment in the wake of the Battle of Shiloh for Garfield and his men wasn't very glamorous. It was in the rear guard, sort of guarding the Memphis and Charleston Railroad, but there was a little bit of excitement back home for Garfield, where his friends had reached out to him and they wanted him to run for Congress. Garfield, as he typically would say, is, look, I'm not getting involved in that. I'm happy to answer the call if that's what you want, but I'm not going to be seen as pining for one of these opportunities. But he gave the message through that if his friends wanted to draft him into that spot, he would be open to it. Meantime, he had other things to worry about. He was sick. Camp fever, which often caused lots of casualties in the Union Army, had struck him. He lost 43 pounds in a single month before he finally said, you know what, I need some rest. He took leave. The Brigadier General went home to his wife and daughter in Hiram, and this was actually a good move on a couple of levels. They weren't that busy at this point in the war. He definitely needed to take care of his health, and he needed to work on his marriage, which was continued to be pretty rocky. It just wasn't all that strong, and this was a bit of a turning point. He spent some time at Howland Springs with his daughter Trot, of obviously his wife Crete. She nursed him back to health, and it was actually a source of intimacy for the couple that had sort of been missing that for so much of their marriage. It was a positive move in their time together. Well, the Confederates were showing some strong signals in 1862 that President Lincoln was worried, and he took a bold move. Lincoln issued his draft Emancipation Proclamation in September of 1862, right after the battle at Antietam, and it said on January 1st, 1863, any area still in rebellion, all slaves would be freed in those areas. And James Garfield was completely on board with this. Garfield said he himself was coming nearer and nearer to downright abolitionism. Before God, I here record my conviction that the spirit of slavery is the soul of the rebellion and the incarnate devil which must be cast out before we can trust in any peace as lasting and secure. Fully supportive of the move, in this case by his commander-in-chief. Politics at the time, again, while Garfield was home, again, he wasn't campaigning, but his friends were on his behalf. They went to the polls. First of all, he got the Republican nomination, which was key in his district, and sure enough, he was elected to the United States Congress. But still, 13 months before he would take his seat, he still had plenty of fighting to do, or at least he thought. As he was fully recuperated, it was time to get back in that fight, and he was shipped off to Washington, D.C. to get his next assignment. But there he sat. For weeks and eventually months, no assignments were coming his way. He reached out continuously to the Secretary of War, Edwin Stanton. It was kind of out of his hands, and he got really bitter about a lot of the West Pointers who were getting some of the plum assignments while he was sitting around Washington, D.C., wearing his uniform with nowhere to go. He did reacquaint himself with Salmon, the former governor of Ohio, who had gone on to become a senator, and now was the Secretary of the Treasury. And this was a learning opportunity for James Garfield, and he never passed on a learning opportunity. It's an opportunity to learn about finance and the economy, and to learn about things like greenbacks and gold and the different kinds of currency, and all of these things would inform the future policies of James Garfield. He got a lot of that during the war in his time together with Salmon. But he was chafing for an opportunity, and he said, they must give me something to do, or they must take my commission. I will not endure it. So finally, though, in early of 1863, he got an assignment. It was to go join Major General William Rosecrans, who was the commander of the Army of the Cumberland, based in Murfreesboro, Tennessee. Made a quick stop in Hiram to see his family, and then immediately reported to duty with Rosecrans, who actually did not have a field assignment for him. He sort of became part of Rosecrans's inner circle, and in fact, they bonded almost immediately. They were both conversationalists, both intellectuals. They stayed up late into the night almost every night. They'd talk religion and politics, the war, literature. They really became a very close bond, and so Rosecrans decided to offer Garfield a job in his inner circle, in fact, as his chief of staff. He wanted to elevate that position to a general officer role. Now, Garfield, this is not what he really wanted to do in his final months in the war before going off to Congress, but he thought it was an opportunity to be strategic, to be a leader, to help Rosecrans plan these fights, take the men into battle, so eventually he agreed to the responsibility. But they were also in a wait-and-see mode. Why? Because Rosecrans continued to wait for more reinforcements, more training. He wasn't ready to take the fight to the enemy. It was frustrating for his men. It was frustrating for the commanders in Washington, D.C., and eventually even frustrating for James Garfield, who, despite being his close friend, wrote to Salmon that thus far the General Rosecrans has been singularly disinclined to grasp the situation with a strong hand and make the advantage his own. I write this with more sorrow than I can tell you, for I love every bone in his body. And next to my desire to see the rebellion blasted is my anxiety to see him blessed. But even the breadth of my love is not sufficient to cover this almost fatal delay. Finally, at the end of June 1863, Rosecrans said it's time to go, and he had 65,000 men. Their focus was Braxton, Bragg, and the Confederates near Tullahoma, where they were dug in, and Garfield helped craft the strategy for this fight, which worked almost flawlessly. They originally started out by attacking the left flank of the Confederates. The Confederates adjusted. It opened up the Manchester Gap on the Confederate right. This was tough fighting. 9 days of fighting before Bragg finally gave up. He withdrew his men, took them across the Tennessee River into the safety of Chattanooga. Now, this all occurred the same time when General George Meade was getting his big victory at Gettysburg in Pennsylvania, and General Ulysses Grant was ending his siege with a big victory in Vicksburg. So a lot of activity going on here in late June and early July of 1863. President Lincoln was thrilled with what Grant had done, but he wasn't so happy with either Meade or Rosecrans. He was upset with Meade because Meade allowed General Robert E. Lee and the Confederates to escape from Pennsylvania back into the safety of Virginia. He thought that was a lost opportunity. As for Rosecrans, he continued to be frustrated. He wasn't following up to try to destroy Braxton, Bragg, and his Confederates, and so he was nervous. He was upset at the slowness and the pace that Rosecrans was going forward with the fight. Well, finally, Rosecrans did cross the Tennessee River, upon which Bragg retreated out of Chattanooga, and he dug in, but Rosecrans didn't know exactly where. He thought he was actually far away, but he only went about a dozen miles to a place near Chickamauga Creek. So on September 20th, this is 1863, Rosecrans took his men through Missionary Ridge, which oversaw Chattanooga, through the Rossville Pass. And his battle rhythm was he would bark out the orders and General Garfield would write them out and send the orders to the commanders. And that took place all that day except one order. For some reason, Garfield wasn't in the communication for the order that went to Brigadier General Thomas Wood. Wood was ordered by Rosecrans to relocate his men to fill a hole in the Union line. Well, this turned out to be a disaster because moving Wood's men opened up another hole that General James Longstreet exploited almost immediately, crashing through that opening, and that sent the Federals racing back to the safety of Chattanooga. All except the group under General George Thomas. Now, he was out of communications. The trees and the terrain were such that he was separate from Rosecrans and his main command. And so while about 2/3 of the force under Rosecrans were retreating back to Chattanooga, Thomas was unaware that this was going on. Well, at the Rossville Gap is where Rosecrans and Garfield met and they talked about the situation. And here the story gets a little murky. According to Rosecrans, he ordered Garfield to go inform Thomas about the plans of what was happening with the rest of their force. Garfield saw it as he had volunteered to do it, while Rosecrans would then go back into the safety of Chattanooga to set up the defenses with his men. And this telling the story would actually have several connotations for sort of the history of and reputation of both men. But needless to say, the one thing was for sure in Rosecrans' mind, he didn't think he would ever see James Garfield alive again. This was a really dangerous mission. To get to Thomas, somehow Garfield had to get through the Confederate line. There was no way to go around it. The line was simply too long. And so Garfield had one guide and a couple of orderlies with him trying to find Thomas, trying to find a way to break through. Eventually, in the middle of the afternoon, they found themselves in a cotton field when all of a sudden, withering fire is coming at them from the Confederates. One orderly was killed immediately. Another was wounded. Garfield's horse took a couple of shots, but he was unharmed, and eventually he made it to a ridge to safety. He eventually then took the other couple of people with him, and they finally made it to General Thomas, at which point his horse dropped dead on the spot, but Garfield was able to communicate to Thomas what was going on. At this point, Garfield basically watched the brilliance of Thomas and him defending this area with a horseshoe configuration. Longstreet is sending men after men, but it was the defensive brilliance of General Thomas that actually kept his men and saved the day. According to Garfield, George A. Thomas was indeed the Rock of Chickamauga, which is his new nickname, against which the wild waves of battle dashed in vain. They finally made it to nightfall, and through the night they were able to retreat back to Chattanooga and save those men, but things were still not exactly safe because Bragg immediately came in, put his men on Missionary Ridge, and they had a siege going on all around Rosecrans and his entire army of the Cumberland. So what was he going to do? Well, Rosecrans was replaced. President Lincoln put Ulysses Grant at this point in charge of all of the activity in the West. Grant immediately took his men through the siege lines. They were able to get a few men through into Chattanooga, and he relieved Rosecrans. He was out. General Thomas took his spot, and General Grant was able to break that siege, and he had a really stunning victory when he attacked Missionary Ridge and actually kicked the Confederates out of Tennessee and into Georgia. James Garfield was not around for that fight. He had basically been recalled. It was time to go be a congressman. And he found himself back in Washington, D.C., feeling pretty guilty about all this. He still felt there was a fight to fight and he wanted to be part of it. So he went to the president, Abraham Lincoln, and said, maybe I should pass on Congress and still serve the Union in the Army. And Lincoln said, no. Lincoln said he had more commanding generals around loose than he knew what to do with. I need men who will help us carry the necessary war measures, and besides, we are greatly lacking in men of military experience in the House to promote legislation about the Army. It is your duty, therefore, to enter Congress. And that's what Garfield did. He got a bit of an honorarium, a promotion at the last moment to a second star, a major general, give him a little extra stature when he went into Congress, but he'd have no more battles in the battlefield. His next set of battles would be in the United States Congress. That's James Garfield, and General Officer from the life of James Garfield. For more presidential chronicles, check out my books on Amazon.com. And don't forget to subscribe to my YouTube channel. Until next time, I'm David Fisher, and this is Presidential Chronicles.